Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Keren Kabambi, and I'm the program officer here at NJBEFA. Today's Lunch and Learn is the final program in a series of six hosted by NJBEFA, and this series was meant to be an extension of our commitment to strengthening the impact of community-rooted leaders and organizations. And so we're very excited to have you all join us today. For this session, we are excited to have Sade and Josephine from Melanate. Sade is the founder and leader explorer of Melanate, which is an initiative empowering Black women and Black gender expansive individuals within the resource mobilization and wealth movement space. Malnate's goal is to create an ecosystem where the resource and those resourcing are one and the same by addressing systemic barriers and fostering a supportive community. And as I mentioned, Sade is joined by Josephine, who is a programmatic strategist and social justice executive with over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. So today, Sade and Josephine will be leading us through a discussion on fundraising as movement work and sharing practical tools for cultivating authentic donor relationships. After their presentation, we'll have some time for a short Q&A. So if there are any questions that you have throughout their presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and Joni and I will keep track of those questions. And then following the Q&A, we'll also launch a survey just to gather your feedback, which is really helpful for us to get as we continue improving this program. So any feedback that you have would be incredibly helpful. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Sade, and I will also stop sharing my screen.
Hey y'all, let me just open up my slides. There we go. Y'all should be able to see it. Yeah? Okay, awesome. Great. So I am Sade. Thank y'all for joining me today. I really appreciate it. We're gonna have a conversation. I will do a lot of the talking, but hopefully it'll work out and you'll love it. So this session is really about shifting how we think about fundraising, not as begging for resources or not as performance, but as power, as partnership. What would fundraising look like if it was co-investment in community work? So we'll be exploring how we fundraise effectively if even when donors aren't on the same page as us. At Melanate, our work has always begun and begins with who holds the power, who moves resources, and who gets to define worth and belonging. And our approach within that is that we actually center Black women and gender expansive resource leaders, fundraisers, because they already create and protect and circulate wealth and care. Philanthropy just often ends up catching up with us a little bit later. The work that we practice in our communities, the work that comes instinctually to us, is something that philanthropy has not yet fully adopted into its pedagogy. So we often see as we think through conversations with donors and we engage in fundraising situations where we are navigating a system that just is not set up and designed for the actual work it needs to do. So part of what we do at Melanate is work to shift that culture. And we shift culture by telling stories, by shifting the narrative of who deserves resources and whose expertise counts and what liberation work could actually look like. And ultimately, our goal is to reshape the structures so that our communities can actually lead and thrive and direct capital on their own terms. So before we begin, truly, I want to just go over a couple of intentions that I have and then offer some agreements into the space. Confidentiality, like take the lessons, leave the details. Be honest, you don't have to perform perfection here. For so many of us doing this work day in and day out, we often have to drive some sort of like mask or protection or be like, Black excellence in this space. It can be a little messy, and that is okay. I want you to actively participate, bring yourself into the space, and be respectful within the things that you are holding. And then listen to understand, which really means sometimes we have a tendency to create rebuttals in the moment when folks are speaking, especially when we're taking in new information that may challenge a framework of what we believe. And I really hope that you all agree to remain open in this process. So together, we're going to create a space where you can explore and stretch and challenge the norms that sometimes philanthropy really forces us into. So with that, I'll talk through some of our main goals. Um, they're a little lofty, but I do think that they are achievable. The first thing is that we're going to build awareness of how power shapes our fundraising choices, really thinking about a quick grounding in where we hold influence, even when donors are still catching up. We'll learn some practical tools for equitable values aligned fundraising. So, simple mindset shifts and language that you can start using immediately. And then we're going to work to strengthen your confidence, right? Like understanding how to tell the truth, how to set boundaries, and then also how to expand donor imagination. And hopefully you leave with at least one actionable shift. So at least one small doable change that you can implement right away as you're building resources for your communities. So, with that, I want to talk about power and money. And what I will say is a couple of things. Money and power don't move in a straight line. And this graphic that I developed actually talks about how proximity to community and how financial capital intersect in a way that actually resources power differently. Um, so we see it in every room, every donor meeting. You have someone that has been doing the work in the community. Maybe they were a practitioner, maybe they were a doula, and then they became a program officer, and now they run a health equity initiative, right? Like they have deep proximity. They've got a high level of proximity. And sometimes what we often find is that those people that are leading that have deep community proximity, maybe they have some funding, but they're not going to be able to do $1 million. So where are they on this continuum, right? So trying to figure out where your donors are and having a map to actually place them so that you know the types of conversations and what you need to do and what they need to do to make the partnership successful is a place that I actually just wanted to dive into and start. So, this quadrant helps us understand how we navigate those conversations. So, on the top left, which is right here, so on the top left, we have money without proximity. So, that's like institutions and donors that have a lot of financial power. Like, yes, they could do a $500,000 gift today. But they actually are not grounded in understanding. They don't have folks who have done the work or been impacted by the work in their office. If they do, they have very little positional power. So they're really missing the proximity in their relationship. And that's where a lot of traditional philanthropy lives. We often have program officers who maybe were research fellows and then they became, program officers at the foundation. So they have a lot of the study and the theory, but none of the actual like proximate practice that helps to truly inform the work. And then on the bottom right, we have proximity without money, with less money. Those are kind of like parallels, right? You have people that have deep proximity but don't have the dollars. So those are often birth workers or community members, smaller organizations or coalitions that do small regrants. And they carry often the deepest level of expertise and they live closest to impact, but they often have the least amount of resourcing. They don't really have dollars to distribute wide. On the top right is the sweet spot, right? Like that's money in proximity. That's where everybody wants to live. Those are the funders who have both resources and the context to actually act as true partners and co-conspirators. Those are the people that know the information and also have the dollars to do something about it. And then the bottom left is that other sort of like side of the coin, which are people that are really like low engaged, right? They don't have a lot of dollars, they don't have a lot of proximity, they don't really understand the issues. So neither strong capital nor proximity. And that's not where we focus our limited energy. Our work overall in fundraising is to understand where a donor is in this matrix, where they sit on the map, and then move them by conversation towards proximity, more alignment, and more shared power. So that is where we are. And I want to check to see if anybody has any clarifying questions before we move on, because I'm introducing a matrix to y'all and I want to make sure it's clear. And then, like I mentioned, this is where a lot of folks want to live. We want someone that has lots and lots of money and really, really gets it.
I have a question,
Yeah.
Shade. How feasible, or I guess, because this is a matrix, the way
Mhm.
I'm understanding it is that people can definitely move between them. But for the people who are on the birth workers, how, I guess, easy or is it harder to be able to move up to another category in the matrix with money and higher proximity to financial
Mm.
capital?
So how realistic is it that we
Hmm.
actually get folks to move?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's hard work. An example is I worked with a health equity funder for, oh gosh, it took 18 months. When I first got there, they really had a big gap in their strategy. They did not have people that were informed around like this level of health equity, like this particular health equity point. But they like did a lot of other things that were sort of related that they maybe had more expertise in, like food access and food security. And as they thought about early intervention support from like a birth equity perspective, they really thought about like, direct tools and access to things like diapers, but they weren't thinking about health equity from a different perspective. So they had a really big gap because they just didn't have proximity to the issue. So we did a series of lunch and learns with them, actually very similar to what we're doing here. Basically saying, hey, this is my experience. This is kind of how I am proximate to this issue. This is how some of our other folks that have engaged with us have experienced the realities of this climate. And this is how it connects to your work. And after several of those conversations over the course of 18 months, they actually developed an entire portfolio that addressed the issue that we wanted them to, which eventually worked out because we benefited from it directly with dollars, but then also the sector benefited because we worked with them to move them from a level of that top left quadrant of money without the proximity over more closer to money and proximity because we ended up being their proximate individual. We ended up being the person that informed that matrix for them and got paid to do that, which was good. So does that answer your questions?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah, absolutely. Okay. I'm gonna keep pausing, see if anybody's got anything. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So here are four practices that I really want to support the grounding within. Donors aren't always there. And sometimes they think they are, and they actually are not fully aligned, which I find is unfortunately the case in a lot of philanthropic institutions. A lot of individual donors feel like they really have a good sense and they just have gaps. But even when someone isn't fully there, even when a donor is a little bit behind the curve in their understanding, we still have a lot of choices in how we show up with them and how our relationship with them can grow and how that growth and investment in a relationship can also yield resources. So here are four practices that really help change things. So the first thing is to anchor in values before dollars, which really means just like leading with shared beliefs. Don't start with the budget line. Don't say like, we need $100,000 from you because actually say, here are the ways that our work actually functions as a vehicle for your mission. Have you noticed that? That is an anchor in values. We also believe in intersectionality. We also believe in interconnectedness. And it seems like you do too. That shift by framing values first versus budget can definitely open up doors and create different types of containers for conversations. Other thing is don't shrink the story. Just because something is complex and maybe a little messy doesn't mean that you simplify something just so that someone gets it. You really have to be honest because honest builds trust. But there are so many different ways of being honest. So, for example, if your organization is operating at a $100,000 deficit and you really, really do need their $100,000, or else you may have to close the door, you can say, look, our work is critical, and we're at an inflection point now where we need to double down on our investment. We need to double down on the commitments that we've made to the communities. And it's only feasible with your support because of XYZ. So, like, you can still be honest, but you're not saying the house is on fire and everybody run. Like, those are two very different entry points for conversation. Also, as a fundraiser and as someone that's looking to build resources for your organization, you do have a duty to expand their imagination. Part of what makes philanthropy so interesting is that there really aren't formal rules. Everything's kind of made up. Besides the legal compliance and the tax codes, the way that philanthropy is structured is actually a dream space. Who has a great idea? What feels like it has the ability to make an impact? And then what can we possibly do? So, part of your role, half of fundraising, is helping donors imagine a world bigger than what they've actually seen and helping them understand how resourcing that dream can create the impact that they're looking to achieve. There's also this piece here in the fourth practice is around reciprocity, being visible both ways. So donors do need to feel in relationship with you, not like they're watching from afar, that they're actually a part of the community that they are helping drive, that they're a part of the birth equity movement. The only way that they do that is by you bringing them closer, asking them questions. What have you thought? What do you find? Not necessarily because they're going to help design your program. Do not let funders design your program, but do get their impact on, do get their sort of insight on what have you learned through this process? We've been talking for 6 months. You provided me a grant. I love that. What are things that you've learned? What are things that you're still trying to learn? How are the ways that I can help inform like your learning journey? Like what are the things that we can do together so that your proximity grows? Those are things that I think are also really important. So I'm curious, what feels relevant to you right now? You can drop it in the chat, which practice feels super relevant, something that you've tried. Feel free to pop in any sort of thoughts, but engage because I am going to ask y'all to actually directly respond to some things. So, of the four practices, what feels like something that maybe you haven't done that you would like to do more of? What resonates with you? Anything? Okay, y'all. Y'all quiet. It's not like 500 of us here. Okay, I'm just gonna keep going. All right. So I want to talk through an example of how to navigate a conversation that actually feels quite hard, but is still feasible, like to get through. So here is the here's the situation. So a high net wealth donor, typically you'll see HNWD that's used as like high net worth donor. Some folks in resourcing use high net wealth. I use high net wealth because wealth does not equal worth. So high net wealth donor really loves your mission. Like they are a super fan. They like are down for you. They're trying to figure out how to give you this check right now. And then they kind of are like basically holding on to the money and they kind of say something like, can we talk a little less about racism? Like it just kind of turns some folks off. I'm looking out for you. It's not, I don't have a problem with having a conversation about race, but the sector, like you have to think about your other funding options. So they kind of have this like hesitant moment where they're like, can we just talk less about race? Can we talk less about racism? Like, like as you're talking about equity work, do you have to do that? And you need the funding. You need that check. Your lights need to be on. Your accountant needs to be paid. So what do you do? And they're not coming from a place that's malicious, right? Like genuinely, it does seem like they mean well. They funded projects that are similar to yours in the past. So like, yeah, maybe they mean well, but you also know that the truth matters. And you also know that you need the funding. So like, what do we do? So I like to say, where did it go? Here it goes. Oh, there we go. So the first question is like, where are they on the map? The fact that they're coming to you as an equity service, like you are an equity focused organization, and they are talking to you about how do you kind of roll back race from the conversation around equity, that actually means that they probably aren't as proximate They're more in this left quadrant than they are on the right. But they're already down for you. Like they get the issue. Like they're coming. They're like, yes, I 100% believe about birth rates. I believe in all of the conversations that you're naming. I believe in equal access. I believe in repro rights. Like they are naming all the other talking points because they're like, I have this birth story, but they're missing a really critical piece. So mapping them, they're kind of on this left quadrant, which means that they need education, grounding, and some more narrative alignment, right? And then what do you say in the room? So first, you've identified where they are on the map. And then the next question is, how do you respond? So this is the framework that I use when I'm in live conversations with folks and I'm like, how do I get them to expand their understanding? And how do I do it from a way that is a partnership-based redirect, right? The first thing is to do your own sort of internal assessment. What's your own audit? What's your first emotional response? Are you feeling angry? Are you feeling confused, annoyed, disappointed, tired? Figure that out and name it with yourself because acknowledging your emotion is going to help you also kind of navigate around it. Second, what power do you have in this moment? Right? Like they're a donor and positionally you need their funding, right? So they are in a pretty powerful spot. But what power do you have? You can reframe, right? Like you can explain why you talk about race, why you directly comment on racism as it relates to health equity work. You can educate, you can talk about the disparities, the economic principles, the intersected issues. You can anchor in value. Sometimes it means having hard conversations and transparency. You can talk about visibility and authenticity or cultural norms. You can invite curiosity. Well, why do you think it makes people uncomfortable? What exactly is it that would turn someone off? Like, what is it when we talk about equity that makes race so uncomfortable? You can also just like protect your integrity. You could walk away. You could say, I'm not having this conversation because you obviously don't get it, and you can leave the check on the table. You have lots of options, which means you do have power. Power simply means the ability to influence an outcome. And we need to realize how much power we have in certain situations. So you have the ability to influence the outcome here. So, what power do you have? What are your options? And the third is, what's the line you wish you could say? I often find that this is a really good conversation around, like, again, I'm annoyed and I have so many options right now. And what I really want to say to you is, I'm tired of this being a constant question. I am like, what is the one line that you wish you could say? And then what is the equitable, fundable version of the real truth that you want to say? And then figuring out how to make those adjustments so that you at least acknowledge where you're at and then you talk about where you're going. So, this is kind of the framework that I use whenever I respond to donors. So, sometimes, again, like you may not hold financial power, you may not hold, but you hold narrative power, you hold relational power, there's contextual power as well. There's also the power of proximity. You know the issues. You could gently shift the conversation from avoidance to accuracy. Like you could say, let me offer another way to look at this. Reframing is something that funders really like. They love a different offering. I found that that language also works really well with donors. There are ways to bring data, context, lived experience, or grounding that the donor doesn't necessarily have. Those are all really helpful. Um, and then I want to also acknowledge that although you cannot control a donor's readiness, you can control your clarity, your framing, the truth you bring into the room. So, what I often find is I will preemptively think about tough things that are hard for me to talk about, and then practice talking about them with friends, with family, so that when I end up in a situation with a donor, I don't have something that's necessarily scripted. I don't have like an off the cuff response that's already scripted for them. But I do have a level of comfort talking about the issue head on. And even that simple change can help. So I'm going to pause because I want someone else to give me how they would respond and how they would kind of go through this process. So I'll pause and see if anybody would like to reflect before I speak on what I likely would say in this. All right, I'm gonna keep going, but I do do want to make sure that we're getting what we can here. All right. So the
Wait, should
donor, yeah,
I'm trying to find my unmute button. So just so I understand, for number one, my it would be like as if I'm talking to the donor, my first emotional response if I'm hearing the things. Uh-huh.
yeah. So the all of these are internal, right? So you have to figure out your first emotional responses and how do you actually feel about this? Identifying your own emotion and response to what they have named. So a donor says, "Can we talk less about racism?" Like it kind of like just turns folks off. How do you feel? And do
So
you
like,
know how you feel? Yeah.
yeah, I've actually been there. So very, very uncomfortable. Like a little anxiety mixed with a little bit of, oh, okay, I'm inhabiting a very, very clearly Black body. So I've had experiences. And so, that's odd. My power options in this moment, I can name it. I can name a thing a thing. I can also be quickly analytical to see if are they saying this because they believe this is what is, again, the most helpful without realizing how hurtful it might be in the long run? And are they open to me being able to have a conversation? Like, are they worth the emotional energy of this? And what's one thing I wish I could say? Can't really talk less about racism when it's embedded into everything. So, yeah, number four, I'm thinking about that one, but that's what I came up with.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that's great. I mean, also like the donor's not wrong. Like racism does turn some folks off. So part of it is also kind of like seeing their perspective and being curious around like, well, that's really interesting that you named it. It sounds like you want, because you're not turned off by it, because you have a check in your hand, but you're concerned about what other people are going to think. So that at least shows that there's a level of buy-in. So sometimes it's also understanding the donor's perspective and understanding that they want you to gain more access to money too. They're just like, well, maybe we can sugarcoat it in a different way. Like they're thinking about it because they have that gap in proximity they're not necessarily understanding. Um, okay, so the way that I would go about it, donor goes, can we talk less about racism? Some of the things that I would do is regulate and acknowledge, right? Like I love to start with appreciation. I always center gratitude, even in really uncomfortable conversations. So I typically will say something like, I really appreciate you naming that. I know conversations about racism in particular can feel really sensitive or uncomfortable for some donors, definitely. So this kind of keeps the donor in relationship. Like you're not shaming them, you're not blaming them. And then the next thing is, so like they're already starting from a different place, right? And then the next kind of sentence or thing I would say is like, what we've found is that talking about racism doesn't necessarily alienate partners. It actually just creates really clear solutions and more effective instruments because we're naming explicitly what we're trying to combat. And then say like in New Jersey, the biggest drivers of birth equity. Like sometimes I might start with like an education or grounding, a way to give accuracy without overwhelm, like one really clear stat, one really clear line. That shows that like if we remove race from the conversation, then we actually lose accuracy that saves lives. So something like that. And then the next thing that I would say is probably like, I know that the reason why you're invested in this work, that's that anchoring of the shared values when we go back to the practices. So I would say something like, I know that the reason why you're invested in this work is because you care about healthy families, about safe births, about equitable outcomes. And then just say something like naming racism is part of how we move towards that goal. Like, actually, what that does is it then kind of reframes the donor not as an obstacle, but as like a values aligned partner. Like, you actually believe this too, like that sort of thing. And then I like to invite curiosity, right? Like, this is the way that you assess their readiness to change. Would you be open to hearing more about how we talk about racism with other donors in a way that maybe feels both honest and hopeful, like I would love to have more conversations with you. That also gets a level of consent, right? Because you don't know if the donor is actually ready to engage with you. But then by asking that question, you get consent to continue, right? Like that's actually a really important part of the conversation. Because if they go, yeah, then you can then do like an equitable sort of redirect. Like our work is strongest when the donors show up as partners. Like here's what becomes possible when we resource the work fully. Like then you're talking about the truth around what's driving disparities. Um, and then you figure out how to make them a champion, right? Like, yes, I take their check. Like, yes, I'm going to take this. And also, I'm so grateful for your support. I love that you're with us on this. And I don't want this to be the end of the conversation. So, like, could we talk about additional investment opportunities? Could we talk about how you organize your peers? How are you organizing some of the colleagues that you have on these sort of conversations? Then you talk about the doula cohort or mutual aid fund or whatever it is that feels accessible to anchor that conversation with them. What you really want to do is keep everything values forward and open, creating open spaces where they feel like they have the ability to learn, because that's what helps move them kind of across their learning journey. That's what gets them a little bit more proximate. Okay. So, another tool that I have, because I'm giving y'all some like, here's a little scenario, here's a little practice. But a tool that I really like is this idea of like the power positive ask. So one thing that I find often happens is that sometimes donors will position themselves as like the hero of the story, like the savior, right? And like what you're really looking for when you're developing a relationship with the donor is that y'all both understand your roles, right? Like you're not here to be a savior. I'm not here to be saved. We are looking for partnerships. So here's what becomes possible together. Like that sort of framework is always what you are working towards, where you are not disenfranchised, you are not disempowered. It is power positive, right? So when you're looking for contribution, when you're looking for a grant, when you're looking for a donation, you're coming from this space. So we talk about power positive ask, we're talking about a way to invite donors into work that's grounded in those shared values, right? So honesty, possibility, shared responsibility. We're not minimizing or centering donor comfort. We're asking for three types of things. So the first thing is that you then have to lead with a level of truth and not data, not just data. Like the statistics, it's hard for people to really contextualize the robust amount of numbers that exist in a lot of our fields. So, truth often means naming what's driving inequality, lived realities, systemic forces, community expertise are all things that you draw on. And that's really what storytelling does in a way that sort of honors dignity. You have to give people what the truth is. This is the circumstance. This is the landscape. Because again, many donors are not proximate. So they genuinely do not understand. They genuinely do not know. So you have to lead with the level of truth that centers the humans that are being impacted by your work. The other one is inviting them again, like that level of curiosity, the invitation that's not centered in like guilt or like you should change this because of XYZ, but really that expansion of imagination that we talked about a couple slides ago is instead of pushing someone, we're showing them what becomes possible when it's fully resourced. It's about them moving with us towards hope and investing in something that they have not seen before. Even if they've invested in like, doula training programs before, they haven't ever done it with you in this way. So you're always investing in a dream of possibility. And then there's a piece of shared agency, right? Like the collective responsibility that they then are in partnership with you. And it's actually creating a really clear boundary, right? Community leads the work. Donors are joining as co-investors, but they're not commanders. They're not going to drive the work, but they are a part of the community now by being in this network. And what that does is it reframes giving as a part of collective action. And that's something that's really critical as you think about keeping someone engaged as a donor year over year, is making them a part of that collective action piece. So when you put these three together, the truth, the invitation, and that level of shared agency, the ask will always be fundable and equitable. So, saying something like our work is strongest when donors show up as partners, like that piece, it would be an example of like how that ask would be. So here's what becomes possible when we fully resource this, and this is what we're looking for from you. And it does a couple of things, like when you start with that space. It honors the truth, it reframes the donor's role, and then it also moves them towards a level of readiness, without shaming them, right? Like, because they can say something that's like, why are we talking about race while handing you a check? But it still has this level of integrity preservation and alignment. So you're not really softening the truth, you're just delivering it in a way that the donor is actually able to hear, moving them towards proximity. And really, for y'all, I would say that fundraising is hard and it's definitely about relationships. And what I find is that the mindset shift needs to happen both for you and them. Sometimes it's about being willing to have conversations in this way, regardless of whether or not folks are with you in that moment. It's about practicing and honing the skills so that you can bring people along as they increase their readiness. But donors don't necessarily have to be ready for equity for you to actually practice equitable fundraising. So my question really is like, what's one shift that you think that you can make that doesn't depend on readiness? So, your truth doesn't depend on it. The way that you navigate your own dignity doesn't depend on their comfort. The clarity that you provide when you bring things to conversation or light to conversation does not require a level of donor readiness. But yeah, if you have anything, feel free to drop it in. If not, I'll go to closing thoughts. Okay. So, things I like to tell people is that fundraising is not simply about asking for money. It really is about shifting how resources circulate. Um, it's thinking about fundraising's power work, it's narrative work, it's storytelling work, it's relational, deeply so. As humans, we have something, and in order for us to give it to somebody else, we have to kind of feel a part of our identity in them. So that level of relationship work is really critical to fundraising. And it's justice work, resource development work, fundraising work is a part of movement infrastructure, and it's justice work. So when you bring that level of alignment and truth and possibility into a room with donors, even in small ways, you are shifting the culture of philanthropy itself by simply practicing it in this way. Um, yeah, so now we can talk for a little if it makes sense. But that's what I've got for y'all. Please make sure that you check us out. We're on Melanie. Feel free to find us on melanie.org and feel free to find us on LinkedIn. But that really is the extent of my presentation.